the suffocating darkness of horror's pantheon, few figures cast as long and grotesque a shadow as John Kramer, the man who would become Jigsaw. His legacy is not carved in stone, but etched in screaming flesh, written in blood across cold concrete floors, and burned into the psyches of those unfortunate enough to wake in his specially designed chambers of torment. This is not merely a study of a fictional killer. This is an autopsy of ideology gone cancerous, a dissection of philosophy twisted into something unrecognizable, and an exploration of how suffering can be weaponized, packaged, and delivered with surgical precision. What transforms Jigsaw from a mere antagonist into an icon of terror is the uncomfortable truth at his core. He believes every word he speaks. There is no winking at the camera, no self-aware villainy. In the cathedral of his own mind, John Kramer is not a monster. He is a prophet, and perhaps nothing is more terrifying than a killer who genuinely believes his victims should thank him as they bleed. The genesis of a monster. Trauma as transformation. Every monster has an origin story, and Jigsaw's begins not with violence, but with soul-crushing loss that hollows out the man and leaves only the ideology behind. John Kramer was once, by all accounts, an ordinary man. He was an engineer, a husband, a father to be. He understood the world through measurements, calculations, and logical progressions. Life made sense in terms of inputs and outputs, cause and effect. Then the universe ripped that understanding away from him with brutal efficiency. The death of his unborn child. Gideon, at the hands of a drug addict who slammed a door into his pregnant wife's abdomen, was the first domino to fall. This wasn't just grief, it was the obliteration of future itself. Every imagined birthday, every first word, every milestone dissolved into nothing. His marriage, unable to bear the weight of shared trauma, collapsed next. And finally, as if the cosmos itself wanted to ensure his complete destruction, terminal cancer began its slow feast upon his body. Colon cancer, aggressive and unforgiving, spreading through him like a metaphor made flesh. These cascading catastrophes would drive most to despair or resignation. John Kramer chose a different path. He drove his car off a cliff, not in a moment of passion, but with calculated intent. He wanted death. He sought it. And in that crucial moment when his vehicle plummeted toward oblivion, something inside him transformed. He survived. Against probability, against logic, against everything he understood about physics and impact and mortality, he survived. And in that survival, bloodied and broken amid the wreckage, John Kramer died and Jigsaw was born. This is the dark epiphany that would define everything to follow. Suffering as salvation, pain as purpose, death as teacher. In that moment of agony, feeling every injury, every broken bone, every torn ligament, Kramer claimed to have found clarity. He didn't see his survival as luck or chance. He saw it as rebirth, as a second chance to appreciate the precious gift of life he had been so carelessly throwing away. And with the fervor of all converts, he would dedicate his remaining time to forcibly granting others this same enlightenment. The philosophy of the trap, moral engineering. Jigsaw's methodology is horrifyingly systematic. He doesn't simply kill, he curates experiences. Each trap is not a punishment, but a curriculum, a brutal lesson plan designed to address specific moral failings. This is where his engineering background fuses with his twisted philosophy to create something truly nightmarish. Moral mechanisms, devices that don't just threaten physical destruction, but demand ethical choices under the worst possible circumstances. Consider his mantra: repeated with religious conviction. Cherish your life. 3 simple words that become a commandment. A law carved not in stone but in scarred flesh. But Kramer takes this further. He doesn't believe people can simply be told to appreciate life, they must be shown. Forced to claw and struggle and bleed for every additional second of existence. Only then, he insists, will they understand the value of what they've been wasting. This philosophy manifests in the careful selection and design of each game. A man who claimed disability benefits while secretly healthy is forced to crawl through razor wire. His lies made literal as his body is shredded by the deception he perpetrated. A woman who attempted suicide must prove she wants to live by enduring escalating physical trials. A doctor who rushed through patient care, treating people as numbers rather than lives, must perform a precise and delicate task while restrained, experiencing firsthand the consequences of his professional negligence. The genius, if such a perverse word can be applied of Jigsaw's approach, lies in his use of aversive conditioning, a legitimate psychological technique corrupted into something monstrous. In normal therapeutic settings, aversive conditioning might involve mild negative stimuli paired with unwanted behaviors to discourage them. Kramer takes this concept and amplifies it to grotesque extremes. The negative stimulus isn't discomfort, but potential dismemberment. The behavior being discouraged isn't a bad habit, but what he perceives as moral failing. And the conditioning occurs not over time, but in compressed moments of absolute terror, where every second stretches into eternity. What makes this particularly insidious is the metaphorical precision he employs. His traps are never random. They are always thematically linked to the victim's sins. The man who looked at his life through the lens of a camera, voyeuristically observing rather than participating, must literally cut into his own eye. The person who spoke lies must choose between speaking to call for help or preserving their life. This symbolic dimension transforms each trap from simple torture device into a twisted morality play. A sermon delivered in screaming metal and dripping crimson. The theater of impossible. Choices Jigsaw's games are exercises in psychological demolition. He doesn't simply want to hurt his victims, he wants to break them in ways that can never be repaired. To force decisions that will haunt them far more than any physical scar. This is where his understanding of human psychology becomes most evident and most terrifying. The structure of his games almost invariably presents impossible choices. Do you soar through your own foot to escape, or do you remain shackled and die? Do you cause harm to another person to save yourself, or do you accept your own death? Do you betray your principles to survive, or do you maintain your integrity and perish? These are not hypothetical trolley problems discussed in philosophy classrooms. They are immediate, visceral, and agonizingly real. This creates what psychologists call a double bind, a situation where every available option leads to some form of loss. In Jigsaw's games, you might survive physically, but at the cost of your humanity. You might preserve your moral character, but lose your life. You might save yourself, but doom another. There is no winning, only degrees of losing. And this is entirely intentional. The psychological impact of such choices extends far beyond the game itself. Survivors, those rare individuals who manage to navigate Jigsaw's gauntlets and Lavar, left with trauma that conventional language struggles to describe. They have been forced to become active participants in their own torture. They have made decisions that no human being should ever have to make, and they must live with those decisions forever, replaying them in nightmares, questioning whether they chose correctly, wondering if there was some alternative they missed in their panic. This is compounded by Jigsaw's masterstroke of cruelty. He always provides hope. Every trap, no matter how deadly, has a solution. Every game, no matter how impossible it seems, has a key, a code, a way out. This sliver of possibility is psychologically more damaging than simply killing his victims would be. It means they cannot blame fate or bad luck. If they die, it is because they failed. If they survive, but at terrible cost, it is because they made that choice. He transforms them from victims into agents of their own suffering, and that transformation is permanent. The addition of time limits adds another layer of psychological warfare. The ticking clock isn't just a narrative device, it's a weapon. It creates artificial urgency, forcing decisions to be made in states of extreme stress when rational thought is nearly impossible. The human brain under such pressure reverts to its most primitive modes of operation: fight, flight, or freeze. Complex moral reasoning becomes neurologically inaccessible. And yet Jigsaw judges his victims based on the choices they make in these impossible circumstances, as if clarity and wisdom could exist in moments of pure terror. The apprentice system, manufacturing monsters. The most disturbing aspect of Jigsaw's psychology is his ability to not merely kill, but to corrupt. To take damaged individuals and mold them into extensions of his will. His apprentices Amanda Young, Mark Hoffman, and others represent different facets of his influence and different outcomes of his ideology. Amanda Young is the archetype of the true believer. She entered one of Jigsaw's traps as a victim and emerged as something else, entirely a convert. Her game involved a reverse bear trap locked around her head, set to tear her jaw apart unless she could retrieve a key from the stomach of a paralyzed man. She succeeded. She survived. And in surviving, something in her psyche fundamentally rewired itself. Rather than recognizing Kramer as her tormentor, Amanda experienced what can only be described as traumatic bonding taken to its darkest extreme. He had, in her view, saved her from herself. Her life before the trap was one of addiction, self-destruction, and purposelessness. The trap gave her clarity. It gave her a moment of absolute simplicity where the only thing that mattered was survival. And that simplicity was, in its own horrifying way, a relief. Kramer recognized in Amanda exactly what he needed: someone psychologically vulnerable enough to be molded, traumatized enough to be grateful for any meaning in her suffering, and damaged enough to accept his philosophy as gospel. He became her father figure, filling a void in her life that had perhaps always existed. He gave her purpose, structure, and most dangerously, ideology. She wasn't just helping a killer, she was participating in a grand design, a higher purpose, a form of brutal salvation. But Amanda also reveals the fatal flaw in Jigsaw's philosophy. As she took on more responsibility for the games, her own damage began to show. She couldn't maintain Kramer's supposed purity of purpose. Her games became unwinnable. Her traps grew more savage, more personal, more about punishment than testing. She killed out of jealousy and possessiveness, not philosophical conviction. In trying to create a successor, Jigsaw instead revealed that his ideology, when adopted by others, simply becomes a framework for sadism. Detective Mark Hoffman presents a different case entirely. Hoffman wasn't saved by Jigsaw. He was trapped by him. Originally a copycat who used Jigsaw's methods for personal revenge, Hoffman was discovered by Kramer and given a choice: become an apprentice or be exposed. This was coercion, not conversion. Hoffman never truly believed in the philosophy. He saw it as methodology, as tools for his own ends. This makes Hoffman perhaps more frightening than Amanda in some ways. He demonstrates how Jigsaw's methods can be weaponized by someone without even the pretense of higher purpose. In Hoffman's hands, the games become purely about power, control, and revenge. The testing aspect becomes theater. The supposed lessons become irrelevant. What remains is simply torture and murder. Dressed in philosophical clothing, the apprentice system also reveals Jigsaw's fundamental arrogance. He genuinely believed his ideology was so powerful, so transformative, that it could be transferred to others and remain pure. He saw himself as creating a legacy, a movement that would continue after his death. Instead, he created only more killers, more suffering, and more proof that his entire philosophy was built on a foundation of self-deception. The God complex control in the face of chaos at the core of John Kramer's transformation into Jigsaw lies a psychological need that dwarfs all others. The desperate desire for control in a universe that has proven itself to be utterly, catastrophically chaotic. Every loss he suffered, his child, his marriage, his health, represented another instance of his powerlessness. Life was happening to him, and he had no ability to stop it, prevent it, or even understand it. The Jigsaw persona is his response to this existential crisis. In his civilian life, Kramer was a man to whom things happened. As Jigsaw, he becomes the one making things happen. He doesn't experience life. He orchestrates it. Every detail of every trap, from the mechanical specifications to the psychological profiles of victims to the exact wording of recorded messages, is planned with meticulous precision. Nothing is left to chance. Nothing is beyond his control. This is the behavior of someone trying to impose order on a universe that has shown itself to be fundamentally disordered. By creating these controlled environments, his games Kramer establishes himself as the absolute authority. He sets the rules. He determines the conditions. He decides who lives and who dies, or more accurately, who is given the opportunity to save themselves. In these moments, within these traps, he is God. This God complex manifests in particularly chilling ways. Consider the video recordings he leaves for his victims. He speaks to them with absolute authority, with certainty, with judgment. He has assessed their lives, found them wanting, and decreed their punishment, or rather, their test. The tone is never one of rage or hatred. It's almost clinical, pedagogical even. He is a teacher disappointed in a student, a father punishing a wayward child, a deity testing a follower's faith. The mechanical nature of his traps also speaks to this need for control. As an engineer, Kramer understands machines. Machines are predictable. Machines follow rules. Machines don't die of cancer or cause miscarriages or leave you. By expressing his philosophy through mechanical devices, he attempts to make morality itself into something mechanical, something with clear cause and effect relationships, something that can be calculated and predicted and controlled. But this God complex is ultimately revealed to be hollow. Kramer cannot control whether his victims learn the lessons he intends. He cannot control how his apprentices interpret and continue his work. He cannot control his own body, which continues to deteriorate despite all his efforts. And he cannot control the ultimate outcome of his legacy, which is not enlightenment, but simply more violence, more trauma, more death. His desperate grasp for control only proves how utterly out of control everything really is. The moral gray zone, making monsters compelling one. Of the most disturbing aspects of Jigsaw as a character is how the narrative occasionally seems to validate his perspective, or at least present it as worthy of consideration. His victims are rarely, if ever, completely innocent. They are drug dealers, corrupt officials, insurance fraudsters, abusers, and exploiters. They have, in various ways, caused harm to others. They have, as Kramer would say, wasted the gift of life. This creates a deeply uncomfortable dynamic for the audience. We know what Jigsaw is doing is wrong. We know his methods are monstrous. And yet, when we learn that a particular victim has, for instance, committed insurance fraud that resulted in people dying because they couldn't afford treatment, there's a moment, however brief, however quickly we suppress it, where we might think, well, maybe they do deserve some kind of punishment. This is the genius of Jigsaw as a horror villain. He makes us complicit. He forces us to confront our own capacity for judgment, our own desires for retribution, our own complicated feelings about justice and punishment. The question he poses isn't just how far would you go to survive, but also how far should someone go to make bad people face consequences. The films themselves seem to struggle with this question. At times, they present Kramer as purely villainous, his philosophy as obviously wrong. At other moments, particularly in his interactions with apprentices or in flashbacks, he's given almost sympathetic dimensions. We see his pain, his loss, his desperation. We understand, if not agree with, how he arrived at his conclusions. This moral ambiguity is intentional and deeply effective. It forces us to engage with the character on a level beyond simple revulsion. This is compounded by the structure of the films themselves. We, the audience, are placed in the position of observers to these games. We watch people face impossible choices. We judge their decisions. We predict whether they'll survive. And in doing so, we become participants in Jigsaw's philosophy. We are, in a sense, playing his game alongside his victims. We are answering the question he poses. Do you deserve to live? Would you fight for it? What would you sacrifice? The moral gray zone extends to questions about punishment and rehabilitation. Jigsaw's victims who survive often claim to be changed, to have a new appreciation for life. Amanda Young is the prime example, but there are others scattered throughout the franchise. Does this validate his methods? Of course, not the ends cannot justify such monstrous means, but the question lingers. If someone genuinely does change, genuinely does become a better person after such an experience, what does that mean? Can suffering ever be redemptive? And if we say no, are we denying the experiences of people who have faced real trauma and emerged transformed? These questions have no easy answers, and Jigsaw doesn't provide them. He simply poses them, again and again, in increasingly elaborate and horrifying ways. The ripple effect, trauma as contagion. Jigsaw's influence doesn't end with his direct victims. Like a stone thrown into still water, his actions create ripples that extend far beyond the immediate impact. Families are destroyed. Detectives are traumatized. Survivors carry psychological scars that never fully heal. And his apprentices carry his poison forward into the world, spreading his philosophy like a disease. Consider the police officers who investigate his crimes. Detective Eric Matthews, Detective Stephen Singh, Detective Alison Kerriach. One is drawn into Jigsaw's web and fundamentally changed by it. Matthews becomes obsessed, violent, consumed by the need to stop Kramer. Kara's dedication to catching him becomes the very thing that makes her a target. They aren't just investigating murders. They're trying to understand a mind that operates on principles completely foreign to normal human psychology. And in trying to understand it, they risk being infected by it. The families of victims face a different kind of horror. They must grapple not just with loss, but with the knowledge of how their loved ones died. They must process the fact that their family member was judged, found wanting, and subjected to torture. They must live with video recordings, with evidence, with detailed descriptions of suffering. And they must confront the possibility, planted by Jigsaw's philosophy, that maybe their loved one did do something wrong, did deserve some form of consequence, even if not this. This ripple effect is perhaps most evident in The Apprentices and their victims. When Amanda or Hoffman design games, they're not creating original traps. They're creating iterations, variations, echoes of Kramer's work. They're spreading his ideology, his methods, his philosophy. They're ensuring that his influence continues long after his death. Each new victim is indoctrinated, whether they survive or not, into Jigsaw's worldview. They're forced to see life through his eyes, to accept his framework, even if only for the duration of their test. The trauma becomes generational, spreading outward through time and relationships. A survivor might seem to recover, might even claim to be grateful for the experience, but what happens to their relationships? How do you trust someone who knows they're capable of cutting off their own limb to survive? How do you love someone who chose their own life over another's? The scars are not just physical, but relational, social, communal. This contagion of trauma also manifests in the copycat killers who emerge. Hoffman was the first, but the films suggest others would follow. Jigsaw's methodology, once released into the world, becomes a template. Anyone with a grievance, anyone who believes they understand morality better than others, anyone who wants to play God, now has a framework to do so. Kramer didn't just kill individuals, he poisoned the culture itself with his philosophy. The ultimate game. The trap set for us, but perhaps the most insidious trap Jigsaw sets, is the one he sets for us, the audience. By creating such elaborate games, by justifying them with philosophy, by selecting victims who are morally compromised, he forces us to engage with questions we'd prefer to avoid. He makes us complicit in his worldview simply by watching, simply by considering his perspective, simply by finding his character compelling rather than merely repulsive. This is the meta-horror of the Saw franchise. We pay money to watch people be tortured. We discuss the traps, rate them, debate which ones are most clever or most cruel. We analyze Jigsaw's psychology, try to understand his motivations, argue about whether his philosophy has any merit, and in doing so, we are, in a very real sense, participating in exactly what he wants. We are engaging with suffering as entertainment, with torture as thought experiment, with death as spectacle. The films themselves seem aware of this dynamic. They present the traps with loving detail, with dramatic cinematography, with careful pacing designed to maximize tension and impact. They make the games compelling to watch, even as they're horrifying to imagine experiencing. This creates a profound discomfort in the thoughtful viewer. Are we, by watching and enjoying these films, somehow validating Jigsaw's worldview? Are we the ones being tested? The question, "What would you do?" is the hook that keeps us engaged. We imagine ourselves in the traps. We plan our strategies for survival. We judge the decisions victims make. And in doing so, we accept the premise of the games themselves, that such decisions are worth contemplating. That survival, under any circumstances, is paramount. that we can judge others based on what they do in moments of extreme duress. This is Jigsaw's final victory. He doesn't just exist within the fiction of the films. He exists in our minds, in our imaginations, in our nightmares. Long after the credits roll, we continue to play his games. We continue to consider his philosophy. We continue to engage with the questions he poses. He becomes a permanent resident in our psychological landscape, a dark voice asking uncomfortable questions about morality, survival, and the value of life. The legacy of lessons written in scars in the end. What is John Kramer's legacy? Is it the survivors who claim to be changed, who insist they now appreciate life more fully? Is it the apprentices who carry his work forward? Is it the detectives driven to obsession or madness trying to stop him? Or is it something more insidious, the normalization of torture as moral education, the acceptance of suffering as valid teaching method, the corruption of justice into vengeance dressed in philosophical clothing? The Saw franchise ultimately reveals Kramer's philosophy to be what it always was: the desperate rationalization of a broken man trying to impose meaning on meaningless suffering. He couldn't accept that his losses were random, that his cancer was simply bad luck, that life is fundamentally chaotic and unjust. So he created a narrative where suffering has purpose, where pain is pedagogy, where death can be deserved or escaped based on one's moral worthiness. He turned his own trauma into ideology and then inflicted that ideology on others. His victims who claim transformation are likely experiencing a form of trauma response, finding meaning in their suffering because the alternative, that it was meaningless, that they endured horror for nothing, is psychologically unbearable. His apprentices reveal that his philosophy, when adopted by others, simply becomes justification for cruelty, and the detectives who hunt him demonstrate that engaging too deeply with his worldview is itself corrupting. The true horror of Jigsaw isn't the traps, as elaborate and gruesome as they are. It's not the gore, though the franchise certainly doesn't shy away from visceral imagery. The true horror is philosophical. It's the suggestion that suffering can be righteous, that torture can be educational, that we can judge who deserves life and who deserves death based on moral calculations. It's the corruption of justice, compassion, and rehabilitation into something monstrous. John Kramer died believing he was a teacher, a savior, a force for good in a world that had lost its way. In reality, he was a damaged man who weaponized his trauma, who built monuments to his own pain in the form of torture devices, and who convinced himself that his victims' screams were songs of enlightenment. His legacy is not one of lives saved or lessons learned, but of trauma perpetuated, of suffering multiplied, of darkness spreading outward in ever-widening circles. And yet we remain fascinated. We continue to watch. We continue to discuss. We continue to ask ourselves, what would I do? Perhaps that final question is the only honest one in Jigsaw's entire philosophy, not because it has a correct answer, but because it forces us to confront our own capacity for survival, for cruelty, for moral compromise. It forces us to recognize that the line between victim and monster, between morality and expedience, between living and merely surviving, is thinner than we'd like to believe. Game over.